as a filmmaker coming into doing in features, and your relationship with Michael Winterbottom and how that developed as a young filmmaker, how you sort of established a relationship to the point where you were co-directing films with him.
So I had a bit of a dilemma, I think, as most filmmakers do when you're starting out, which is there seems to, there's lots of different ways to try and become a director, and obviously there's no one path, and it's not, you think, well, maybe you do the apprenticeship thing, you work your way up through the industry, and you start off making cups of tea as a runner for famous people, or you could go off and try and make your own films, but then sometimes you're in a bit of a bubble, and it's hard to actually have any inroads into the industry. So I tried to do a bit of a twin-track approach, which was go and be a runner while on weekends or in the evenings I'd try and write or go off and do my own thing. And I was lucky enough, and the first job I ever got was for a company called Revolution Films as their runner, as a kind of an assistant there, which is Michael Winterbottom, the director, Michael Winterbottom, and Andrew Eaton, his producer's company. It was very small at the time, and it's still relatively small, but they make amazing films, and I'd admired him growing up, and so just even being in the same room as him was a massive privilege. So I started off there, answering the phone and sending faxes and photocopying, and as you do. But what was great was that within a couple of weeks of me being there, he'd taken me aside and said, well, what is it, why are you getting into the film industry? What is it you want to do? And I told him I wanted to be a director. And he said, yeah, but can you edit? Can you shoot? Which I could. So he said, all right, cool, I'll keep it in mind. And so I spent 6 months doing what effectively is quite boring stuff, right? But you kind of have to go through a bit of a rites of passage. And then he was doing a film in Manchester, 24-Hour Party People, and he rang me up and said, do you want to come up and shoot second unit camera? So he gave me a camera, and for a few days I'd just go around Manchester filming little bits with some of the actors and filming just some of the stuff they needed. There was a bit where there's kind of section in the film about gun crime, so I'd go and film people in the gun shop and people waving guns around and so on. And then when he finished the film, he said, would you want to cut the trailer? So immediately, suddenly, I'd hopped up and I was actually learning how to make a film. So it became a bit of a film school for me. And then I'd go off and do my own thing, but he is incredibly generous, and he would kind of invite me back, and I edited a film for him, 9 songs. And when we finished that, I was keen to try and make a film about these guys, the Tipton Three, who had been they'd been imprisoned by the US in a naval base in Guantanamo in Cuba. And I was talking to him, I was saying, well, you should do this, it's an amazing story. And he said, well, look, if you're that keen on it, why don't we do it together? And he stuck to it, which is amazing. I don't know if there's anyone, for my money, he's the best filmmaker in Britain today. So I don't know anyone with his level of experience and reputation who would be willing to effectively make a film with the runner. But he did. And then we went on to do another documentary, The Shock Doctrine. And by that stage, I was getting enough recognition that I was just borderline financeable by other people, and so then I could go in and try and pitch my ideas to financiers as well. And
you both won Best Director at the Berlin Film Festival, which must have been a huge accolade to sort of, to get. How, after working on 24-Hour Party People, do you think that working on essentially a music film then influenced, what happened then of you then going away and making 2 feature films with the sort of the theme of music being a central theme to both those films?
Well, weirdly, because 24-Hour Party is one of my favourite films, but I was, in a way, I was kind of trying to avoid going into that area. I didn't want to tread in his footsteps, and I didn't want to, because I've been doing music videos, inevitably you get sent a lot of stuff, which is, oh, well, you know how to shoot a music video, so okay, fine, well, let's do a music film. So we'll do, and I was trying to avoid doing that. And the first film that was offered to me that was like that was this film called Sex, Drugs and Rock and Roll, which was, there's a producer, a really great producer called Damien Jones, who was also friends with Michael and produced a film for him called Welcome Sarajevo. And he approached me a while before about doing a documentary about Banksy. Banksy apparently was interested in doing a documentary with Michael because he'd used clips from Road to Guantanamo in one of his installations. And so Michael was busy, but he put me forward. And we got to the point where we were about to start shooting the documentary, and Banksy changed his mind. And I was pretty gutted at the time. But Damien said, well, I've got this script. Do you fancy looking at it? And I read it, and it was about Ian Dury, and I didn't know anything about Ian Dury in the Blockheads. And I was also trying to avoid doing anything that was music-based, because I thought I'm going to get pigeonholed quite quickly. So I turned him down a couple of times, and he kept on coming back. And I was saying, look, I'm not a dyed-in-the-wool fan. I don't know the time. I wasn't even born when all this was happening. And he said, that's exactly why I think you'd do it. You should do it, because actually what it needs is a fresh sensibility. You want someone who's not going to sit there obsessing over, getting things as they were. They're more worried about the performance and the film. So that's how I ended up doing Sex and Drugs. And the same thing with Spike Island, the film we've just done. I turned that down a couple of times because, again, I didn't want to start being pigeonholed. And I had a film, Ashes, which was very personal and I was desperate to do. And no one wanted to finance. Everyone was saying we were crazy to try and make the film. So I turned it down, but when we'd finally managed to get Ashes made with the same filmmakers as Spike Island, same producers, it got to the end of that process, and they said, well, look, now we've finished this film together, and we worked really well together, would you consider Spike Island again? And rereading it, I loved the script, and actually, the more I looked at it, it wasn't just about the music. It was really, the music was the icing on the cake. It was really a rites of passage about 5 kids growing up. And they happened to be musicians, but they could have been footballers, or maybe they were obsessed with being filmmakers, So actually, it turned out, for me anyway, it wasn't strictly speaking a music film.
Well, what we're going to do now is take a look at the trailer for Sex and Drugs, and then talk a little bit about, working on that as your sort of first feature film. So can you talk a little bit about, I suppose, going into that feature film, the pressures that were under you as the director, then taking it forward in terms of working with the crew, working with Andy Serkis and working with Ray Winstone? I mean, what was it like? Was it a baptism of fire, or were you quite relaxed sort of going into the film?
It was quite tricky because it was definitely a step up in terms of budget and in terms of the way I had to do it, because I'd been slightly sheltered by Michael on the other film, on Road to Guantanamo, and then suddenly doing Sex and Drugs. I don't know about, maybe people know about this, but just to explain that when you do bigger films, you tend to have a bond company. So the bond company comes in to insure the film as a complete entity. So, for example, obviously there's an insurance company to make sure that if someone hops in the back of a van and steals the camera, that's covered, but that you actually insure the entire film as a separate thing as well. And the bond company come in, and you have to square everything with them. You have to say, okay, here's the script, we think we can film this in 5 weeks. Here's the cameraman, he's really good and he's got a track record, he can deliver. And you basically have to go through with everything. You say, for this amount of money, for this schedule, we can deliver a film to you. And if at any point you start going off the rails, say you're not managing to complete everything that you said you'd do in a day, then they can step in, they can fire anyone, if they think that's the best thing to do. So they ensure the film to be completed, not necessarily to make the best film, but just to finish the film. And they you have to square everything with them about who's going to be your crew and who's going to be your cast. So that's quite hard. So suddenly I couldn't just work with those people I'd worked with in the past. I had to bring in new people, and sometimes that was fantastic, and sometimes it was quite difficult, and I didn't really work that well with them. So that was the hardest thing for me, is you'd turn up on set, and you'd say, right, this is how we're going to do it, and someone would tell you couldn't. And because I hadn't worked on something on that scale, you start going, oh, okay, well, what do you suggest? And then it's almost like they start directing the film themselves. So I found that hard, and it took a week or two of a 5-week shoot to finally feel like I was on top of it. So for the first week, really, we weren't getting the film that I wanted to make, and we weren't really making the same, we weren't shooting the stuff that I really felt that I wanted to see in my head. So that was, it was really hard. And inevitably, the Bond company came in and said, look, what's going on? You're going over on days, you're taking too long to do setups. Do you need this scene? Do you need this? So that was tricky politically. That was a bit of a baptism of fire.